Hello YouTube, welcome to RHMakes Studio, and in my first video I'm going to be making the Sorry about that, but like I said, I'm going to be making the
perfect organism.
This specific file was a paid file by Hex3D on the Patreon. I'll make sure I link them in the description below. This entire model was printed on my Elegoo Neptune 4 3D printer using Elegoo's PLA Plus filament. Each of the pieces was scaled to 100% and printed at 20% infill at 200 millimeters a second. You can see here where I zoom in, you'll see a little line. That would be where I PLA welded the front and back of the jaws together on both of these pieces. I use a cheap $15 wood burner I got from Walmart, and that works perfectly for this material. So overall, in the end, you can see that I got myself down to about 4 pieces: the top jaw, bottom, the top skull, and the inner mouth. Now that all of my pieces were ready to go, I went in with 180 grit sandpaper and just did a rough sand over all of my pieces. This was on the bottom jaw, and then I moved on to Bondo coating. This is a process where you take Bondo glazing and spot putty and mix it in with acetone until you get almost a brushable consistency. And then you can go ahead and brush that all over your model, and this should fill up all of those small layer lines that you can't quite get with sanding, especially on this model where I couldn't get some of the gaps and I didn't want to hide much of the detail. This gave me a nice thin layer of Bondo that I could cover the entire model with. Also, a quick side note before I let the time lapse go: always wear proper PPE, especially when sanding things like PLA plastics or using Bondo. A lot of nasty dust comes off that stuff, so keep yourself safe. That Bondo will dry super fast since you're mixing it in with acetone. So once I had about 2 layers on there, I went in with 400 grit sandpaper and did another rough sand just over the high surfaces, not really worrying about the detailed areas, basically just getting everything that I could. The top and bottom jaw of the model both got this same treatment, while the skull was a little different. So on the skull, it had a nice texture printed into it, and I really didn't want to get rid of that. So I hit it with 1 layer of Bondo and sanded with a 400 grit sandpaper on the very high spots. And I was hoping that this would preserve that texture, which we'll see later on it really did. And after this step, I went directly into priming with Rust-Oleum 2-in-1 filler. I made sure I hit as much as I could with about 2 to 3 layers, making sure to go very heavy on my coats. You can see here that the method I used on the skull really kept that texture, and I was very happy with that. This piece required no more sanding beyond this point. This kicks off sanding part 2. So to begin, I went in with 800 grit sandpaper. All of this was going to be done through wet sanding, and I would go all the way up to a 1500. Make sure to always floss your Xenomorph's teeth. After clearing my pieces of any dust, I gave the model a base coat of matte black to start. Once my pieces were connected, there was no way I was going to be able to paint the inside of the mouth, so I started there with a dry brushing of a light blue. The main colors that I focused on dry brushing in this entire model was light blue, and later you'll see where I used a light brown to kind of dull that color down. But inside the mouth, I stuck with the blue to kind of brighten it up in there. Rather than the Xenomorph's chrome teeth, I opted to use this silver paint that I had. I think in the end it came out looking really nice, although I probably would have preferred to use a more chrome paint. To connect the top and bottom jaw, I went in with E6000 and then used Gorilla Super Glue to lock the pieces in place, allowing the E6000 to dry since it has such a long cure time. To paint the skull, I mixed up this kind of nasty yellow that I just went with. As soon as I started airbrushing it onto this piece, it really looked awful, and I really was thinking about going over the whole thing and restarting. But after I went in with the airbrush to add in some black shadows, the overspray from the black or the paint drying turned it this kind of nice bone ancient brown, which I thought really looks awesome. You'll see right at the end. So here's that piece after all the paint dried. And again, I do not know how I ended up with this color. I thought the yellow was awful, and somehow it turned out to work. I mentioned earlier dry brushing on a light brown tan color. So when I was putting the light blue on the underside of the jaw here, it just looked way too bright to me, and I feel like it wouldn't have taken kind of ambient light as well. So I went in with this tan brown to kind of dull down that blue, and I think that worked out great. The inner mouth got the same treatment with that paint, but I aimed for more lighter colors in this, since all of the references I could find leaned more on the side of a white or light green. But since my model I was going with more of a blue color, I just kind of leaned more towards white overall. This piece then got a nice coat of gloss clear coat, just to make it look really nice and wet for when it was inside the mouth. Here's that wood burner I mentioned earlier. Again, I got it from Walmart, very cheap, also very effective. And on to the mess that was vacuum forming the dome for this build. It took me so many attempts. I think I spent well over $100 on this and continued to fail every time.
3 days later. 3 weeks later.
Finally, after adjusting the method that I was using, I started to get some good pulls. My problem was that I was allowing the material to melt too much and it started to fold over itself, where I should have been letting it droop maybe 2 inches and having to struggle a bit to get it down to the vacuum forming base. This dome then got hit with a semi-transparent clear coat on the inside, and then I went in with an airbrush to add the kind of opaque detail on the inside. I thought about dyeing this, but having gone through the process of dyeing a visor in the past, I have always had bad results, and since I only had 2 good pulls for this, I did not want to fail and mess it up. As for mounting this model, I needed to create my own base for it, so I went into Tinkercad and I whipped this little thing up. Once it was printed, I hit it with a coat of the Bondo acetone mixture, sanded real quick, not very detailed. I wanted it to look a little rough for the paint job I was going to give it, and then I went in with some acrylic paints to paint that. And with that, we could move on to some glamour shots. Overall, this project was extremely challenging and required all the knowledge that I had acquired so far in prop building and model making, especially in 3D printing. This was actually a warm-up for my Halloween project, in which I'm planning on making a screen-accurate big chap model of the same type. I know this video is a bit long, but as my first one, I was really aiming to impress. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like below and subscribe, especially if you're interested in seeing more projects like this.